This week on my weekly webinar, we talked about trauma with special guest Dr. Patrick Wanis. When you think of trauma, what comes to mind? Did you know that 26% of children in the U.S. will witness or experience a traumatic event before they turn 4 years old? Most of the couples who come to see me have unresolved trauma, which makes it difficult for us to actually do couples work. Now, I've created for you to go along with this webinar a free guide for you to recognize trauma, the signs of trauma, and how to heal from it. All you have to do is click in the link below. It's in the description to get your free copy. Lastly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so that you'll get the notifications when when I post a new video. Now, let's get into this webinar and understand and realize, or should I say learn, how trauma affects our lives. Something we did not mention in the webinar, Dr. Wanis felt it was really important to share, was the results or consequences of trauma. Okay? Here's a list of how the many ways that trauma can affect us. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, but it gives you an idea of how wide a range of problems trauma affects, and hopefully gives you a sense of urgency in dealing with it. Listen to some of these: depression, anger, aggression, insomnia, hopelessness, shame, people pleasing. I get a lot of people pleasing in my office. Most people would not believe me if I told them that it was connected to trauma. Workaholism and overachievement. I got clients that way. They think, oh, well, I just work hard because I want to be successful. Maybe not. Okay. Generalized anxiety, panic attacks, headaches, substance abuse, addictions, withdrawal and isolation. Some people think, well, I just like being alone, but you weren't born that way. Okay. We humans are community creatures, and we're not born for isolation. Self-destructive and self-sabotaging behavior. And then early death. So again, this is not an exhaustive list, but you can see how there's some things on this list that you just wouldn't think are a result of trauma. And if you have any of these things, maybe it's not a result of trauma, but I would urge you to at least try to find out if you have unresolved trauma, because I promise you it will sabotage your life. Okay. All right. So let's get into the webinar and get this information. And again, remember the free guide in the description. Click the link and you'll get that guide, and it'll help you. It's kind of like a supplement to this webinar, some of the handouts and everything, to help you be more effective at diagnosing trauma and helping you know how to move past it. Okay. All right. Let's get into it. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to my weekly webinar with Clifton Brantley. And tonight I have again with me Dr. Patrick Wanis. And tonight we're going to be talking about trauma. And, as I was doing a few notes, I noticed the date. And so how fitting it is for us to be talking about trauma on a day where we're remembering those who lost their lives in 9/11. And, we always often ask, where were you when 9/11 happened? I was thinking about that today, and I remember where I was. And as Dr. Wanis will share, that's kind of how trauma happens, right? Even though that trauma did not happen to me personally, I remember exactly where I was when that traumatic event happened. And so if anyone lost anyone during that time, you have my condolences. So tonight we're talking about trauma with Dr. Patrick Wanis, and I myself am looking forward to this, and know a lot of you are too. So Dr. Wanis, take it away. I'll let you go.
Well, thank you, Clifton. It's interesting that you talked about 9/11, and there was many of us who were traumatized, but even now in COVID-19, we're re-experiencing trauma. as a result of either social isolation, loneliness, being locked down, losing jobs, etc.
Hmm.
If I were to ask you, and I don't know if you're going to conduct this poll, do you believe you've experienced trauma in childhood? What
Hmm.
would you say, Clifton?
Um, I would definitely say yes. Funny thing, when I went to therapy right before I was 40, and I started talking to the therapist about, what was going on, talk about my childhood, and I'm just sharing. And then she had this look on her face. She was like, "Oh, we got to do trauma work." And I was like, "Trauma work? What do you mean? I had a normal childhood. What do you mean trauma work?" And as she continued to explain to me, I was like, wow, I had no idea that those were traumatic events. But yeah, let me do this poll real quick because I really want to know what other people think. And then afterwards, after you've done your presentation, I want to hear I want to see if uh, their answers are the same. So here we go, real quick. So I'll give you guys about maybe like, 2-3 minutes to answer this. Do you believe you experienced trauma in your childhood?
And it's basically just a yes or no. And in a moment, we're going to explain, or I'm going to explain what is trauma, how trauma affects you, what are the outcomes of trauma, how you heal trauma, the types of trauma, and why trauma negatively impacts your entire psyche. It affects your mind, your emotions, your body, and even your sense of spirituality. And what I mean by that is your connection to the world and whether you're able to live from your heart or not.
Mhm.
What I'd also like to say right from the beginning is I'm sure, Clifton, that the majority of people who are coming on to this webinar already have a sense that they've experienced trauma, or they already know they've experienced trauma.
Mhm.
So one of the most important things I'm going to say to you is that there's a chance that as we're talking about it, some negative or painful emotions are going to come up for you. Please recognize that no matter how bad you feel in this moment, or in that moment, if you get triggered and those emotions come up, that you can be healed, and it can be done gently, safely, easily, and relatively quickly. The next thing to say is be aware right now what is your perspective about the way that you live your life. Because we often use these phrases. I'm a victim of. It could be I'm a victim of trauma, I'm a victim of abuse, I'm a victim of rape, etc. Or I'm a survivor of trauma, abuse, or rape. The words that I use are I have experienced abuse, rape, trauma, or whatever. And then I talk about where I am now. Many of us tend to take what happened to us in the past and still make it part of our present identity. And I'm not talking here about the subconscious impact. I'm talking about the way we view it, that we start putting these words in sentences, I am a victim of, which means you're still there. So step number one is notice the words and the language that you use. Where are you now? You're in the present moment. You've experienced something in the past. The next thing I'm going to say is all trauma can be healed. The third thing I'd like to say is everything has a beginning. Whatever you're experiencing, whatever challenges you have mentally, emotionally, psychologically, all have a beginning. There's even now research that links bipolar disorder to trauma. And you're going to see that in this webinar, how so many of the things that we tend to think as just either chemical imbalances, or I was born that way, or some sort of aberration isn't true. They're all traceable, even to the extent of you potentially inheriting traits, personality, characteristics, and emotions of your grandparents and great-grandparents.
Mhm.
This is what we call behavioral epigenetics. In behavioral epigenetics, we say that there are genes that affect your behavior that you've inherited from your parents, or not just your parents, sorry, but your grandparents and great-grandparents. There's also something else that's important to be recognized, that many of us have certain genes that lay dormant unless something happens to us.
Hmm.
That's what we refer to as epigenetics. So quite a few years ago, not that many years ago, but within the last 10 years, a scientist was doing research into psychopathy and sociopathy. And he discovered that there's a gene which they labeled the warrior gene. And as he's doing this research, he realizes two very important things. One is that the warrior gene is there in many of us, that gets triggered by things that happen in our childhood, in our environment. Then this same scientist realizes he's actually got that gene.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, well, that makes sense because that explains why many people often talk about my behavior as being very, very callous
Your
or
sound changed,
cold.
Patrick. I don't know what happened with your.
Someone's trying to call me. Oops.
Oh, did I lose you?
Okay, I'm back. Sorry, I'm canceling calls. I'm actually using my phone instead of my laptop because I get better quality.
Okay.
So we recognize that the things that happen to us impact us even to the extent of impacting our genes. So the question is, when we think about trauma, what do we first think of? We think about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, we think about someone that's come back from the war and that has suffered psychological trauma. Or we think about someone that's been in some accident and they've experienced physical trauma, or it's also affecting them psychologically. But trauma is much more than that. Trauma is either the fear of harm or the actual harm that has occurred to us, either physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually.
Mm-hmm.
For all of us, it happens in our childhood.
Mm-hmm.
So let me explain it this way. When we're born, we're a clean slate. And by that, I mean, we only really have two fears, the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. The other fears that we have are fears we develop as a result of things that happen to us and as a result of programming. The most important years in your development are the first 2 years, then the first 6 to 8 years, then the first 10 years, then the first 18 years. But the most impactful are the first 2 years. Why? In those 2 years, you're going to develop a sense and a feeling about the safety and security that you have in connection to the people around you and the world around you. It's sort of the answer to the question, am I safe? Will my needs be met? This is what we refer to as attachment style. So in the first 2 years, if your parents really attended to your emotional needs, that means when you cried, they came, they held you, they hugged you, and they even responded to your facial expressions, and they comforted you when you're either crying or screaming or needing something, then you develop what we call a secure attachment style. And I'll explain how this relates to trauma in a moment. Mm-hmm. Secure attachment style means that when you're in a relationship, you feel safe, you feel good, you feel secure, you're able to trust your partner, and you're able to give and receive support from your partner. So you feel good about yourself in that relationship. That's what we call the secure attachment style. Mm-hmm. But what if in your first 2 years as an infant, your parents or your primary caretaker, usually your mother or someone else that was taking care of you, didn't respond to your emotional needs, or she was cold, or she was distant, or she took a long time to respond to you, or left you there crying for hours or even for 5 or 10 minutes. Then what happens is you develop what we call an insecure attachment style. That means when you're in an adult relationship, you respond in an insecure way. And there are 3 types of insecure attachment styles. The first is where you become very clingy, needy. You become very attached to the extent that you become anxious about the relationship. You become almost obsessed about the relationship. And so you're constantly thinking about the relationship and you're constantly wondering, did I screw up? Is this person going to leave me? So you become clingy because you didn't get those needs met in the first 2 years. Mm-hmm. The next insecure attachment style is avoidant, where maybe your mum or caretaker didn't respond to you, so you responded by actually pushing them away. So therefore you get close to someone, then you avoid them. Or the third is either dismissive, which means you dismiss relationship. Oh, I don't need a relationship. Or you're a mixture of those. All of that happens in the first 2 years. Now, imagine what happens when in the first 2 to 4 years, you also experience trauma, how that's going to affect you in your relationships. And we're going to explain that in a moment. I'd like to jump ahead a little bit because I sort of wrote out a rough outline And I want to talk about the impact that your parents have on you, even if they don't do anything bad to you. And what I mean by that is the relationship that you have with your mother or your father. And let's say they weren't abusive. You didn't experience any physical abuse.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't experience any mental abuse. You didn't experience any emotional abuse or any sexual abuse. But what about if you were born to a depressed mother? So you were born, and from the moment you were born, your mother was in a depressed state and was in that state for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
In 1975, an experiment was done called still face. So what they did was they took a mother with an infant who was, I don't know, maybe 8 months to a year old, and they watched the mother interact with the child. And as you know, if you're a parent, the child responds to you and you respond to the child. The child smiles, you laugh. Therefore, the child thinks that they're controlling you. The child makes faces, you make faces. The child makes noises, you make noises. The child points out to the left, you look out to the left, and you're interacting. Then what they said to the mother was, okay, now what we want you to do, just for 2 minutes, put on a still face, no expression. No matter what the child does, you can look at the child, but no expression. So the mother does that. And in this 90 seconds, you look at this child who starts to change. The child is rocking back and forth. The child's arms are going out, almost flailing. The child starts to throw its head back. Then eventually the child starts screaming and turns away because the child's not getting a response from the mother. So if you were a person who was raised by someone that was in a depressed state and therefore was often still-faced, expressionless, and didn't respond to you, then you're also going to have experienced trauma and you're not going to feel safe. Mm-hmm. And this is one of the, I'm going to talk about this more in detail, one of the key aspects of healing trauma is getting you to feel safe again internally, as well as releasing emotions and changing beliefs. So I wanted to share that to say, even if your parent hasn't done anything harmful to you, the way your parent is, the emotions that your parent expresses or doesn't express also impacts you and can be traumatic. Mm-hmm. So let's say you're in the womb and your mother is in a depressed state. That also affects you because when a person is in a high stress state, they're releasing all sorts of chemicals that also affect the embryo. And I'm going to talk about this in a moment. Meanwhile, let's come back to trauma. If hopefully by now you're getting some sort of understanding what trauma is. And again, I explain trauma as a wound or an injury. It's your response to either having been harmed or either having experienced perceived threats. You felt you're in some sort of danger. And then there are different types of trauma, which we'll bring up a slide in a moment. But there are 3 basic types of trauma. The first is acute. That means you had one trauma and it was one time. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe something was done to you. So here we're going a little bit further because I was going to talk about acute trauma, multiple trauma, and complex trauma. But leave this slide up.
Okay.
And you look at the first, and we're talking about the 3 sort of the basic types of trauma that are either emotional, physical, or sexual. Then if you can read the second column, Clifton, the middle column.
Says of neglect, it says physical and emotional.
So here we're talking about whether your parent attended or your caretaker attended to your emotional needs and whether they also attended to your physical needs. And now the third column is about dysfunction within the family. Would you like to read those 3, please, Clifton?
Yeah, so this one has mental illness, an incarcerated relative, mother treated violently, substance abuse, and then the last one, divorce.
Okay, so think about your situation as you're watching this. What was the dysfunction in your family? Because this is a trauma for you. And I know it's really difficult for people to accept that for a child, the separation or divorce of a parent is actually very traumatic. We look at it as an adult and we think, look, I'm not happy, she's not happy. It's not good for the children for us to be unhappy or arguing or fighting or cold or distant. It's better for us to divorce. That's true. Except the problem is the child who's egocentric and believes the universe revolves around them, says, my mummy divorced or my daddy divorced or my mummy or daddy left, therefore they left me. One of the most important things that a child needs is a sense of security. Physical security, emotional security, security of food, water, shelter, and knowing that there's someone there to protect them. They need stability, security, and routine. Once there's separation and divorce, that's gone. So the separation or divorce of a parent is actually a trauma. If one of your parents was incarcerated, that's a trauma. If one of your parents had a mental illness, that's a trauma. What were the other ones, Clifton, because I forgot?
Pull
that slide
illness,
back up.
did you say mental illness?
Yes.
And also
Incarceration.
Incarceration, mother
Separation.
violently, substance abuse.
Right. So they're the two missing. So when the study, this comes from what is known as adverse childhood experience assessment. When they did that, they looked at often the mother being the victim of violence, of domestic violence. But the father can also be the victim of domestic violence, and that's happened as well, or it could be one of your siblings. So did you witness domestic violence in your family? And it might not have been physical violence, it might have been emotional violence. And then also, was someone in your family suicidal? That could connect to mental illness. So these are just some examples of the primary traumas that we assess through the adverse childhood experience assessment. So now start thinking, which one of those 10 did you experience? Was it just one or was it more? So this ACE, Adverse Childhood Experience study, was conducted in 1998 with 17,500 adults, and they traced back the trauma in their life and then realized there was an extraordinary, stunning, shocking link between the traumas and the health outcomes. Now, before I get to talk about that, let me say that, as I said, this assessment looks at 10, but there's actually many more. For example, were you humiliated by your parents? What did your parents say and do? If you grew up in a war zone, then that's another trauma. If you grew up in homelessness or poverty, that's another trauma. Here's one that's become very common in the last 10 to 15 years, being bullied at school, or even having a teacher that bullied you or treated you such that you experienced trauma.
So
now, go ahead.
That makes me have a question, because I don't want you to go too far with this. Two questions. So number one, what if, how if I experience, like a parent had mental health issues, or, someone went to jail, how does that give me trauma? It's not happening to me.
That's a very good question. And the way that we look at that is to say, what is the impact of a parent's incarceration upon the child? The clients that I've worked with who did have an incarcerated parent, the first thing is the sense of abandonment, the sense of neglect, the fact that they lose that relationship with that parent. So there's loss, there's potential neglect and abandonment. Then there's also the loss of sense of security. Then there's the sense of shame and worthlessness. And then there's the sense of, what's my future? Is there hope or is there helplessness? And how does that affect me if I'm going to visit my incarcerated parent in prison, or if my mother says you're never going to visit your father ever again? So now you might also go to the sense of parental alienation. So incarceration has an extraordinary impact, a negative impact, and creates further trauma on the child. And it depends on how that happened. Did you witness your parent being taken away, etc.? The second one that you asked was about mental illness. I gave the earlier example of a parent who might be depressed. But what about if the mental illness resulted in the parent isolating themselves? I had a client like this, and it was, in fact, she was the one that was doing it. When she came to me, she was experiencing extraordinary deep depression. She would send the kids off to school, but then she'd go and sleep in bed all day. And when they came home, she struggled to connect with the children. So when the children tried to connect, they couldn't connect. So there's a loss of a relationship. There's a loss of connection. A loss of connection is definitely a trauma. The next thing is that they don't get their emotional needs met. The child doesn't get his or her emotional needs met. And let's also look at the possibility of, well, how does that mental illness affect the parent's behavior? Are they going to be aggressive? Are they going to be angry? Are they going to be violent? Or are they going to be socially withdrawn? One of the other things that we didn't talk about is a parent who has a problem with alcohol or a parent who has a problem with substance abuse. Any child that's grown up in a house with an alcoholic parent knows about the level of fear and the sense of deep insecurity, because you're coming home and you don't know how's mum, alcoholic mum or alcoholic dad, going to be today. Are they going to be abusive? Are they going to shout? Are they going to scream? And here is an interesting example. A mother who takes her asthmatic child to a doctor, and because this doctor is also working in trauma, asks enough questions to learn that this little girl has strong, powerful asthma attacks every time her dad punches a wall. So here's the dad who might have anger issues, might be alcoholic, might have a mental illness, but every time he punches the wall, it's as if he's punching the girl, in the sense that her sense of safety, security, and stability is gone. So these are really important. Now, there's another slide we were going to pull up just to sort of summarize these different traumas. It's the next slide.
Types of trauma?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can read these very quickly to yourself, but again, it just summarizes the 10 traumas that I listed, whether it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, whether it's some form of neglect, whether it's a parent who had substance abuse problems, a parent who had mental illness, a parent who committed suicide, a parent who was incarcerated, etc. There's another one that I haven't mentioned, and that's loss, the loss of someone. For me, I had a great sense of stability and security in the first 10 years because of my closeness to my maternal grandmother. But then she died when I was 10 and a half. That was a trauma for me because that was the only person with whom I'd ever had a real connection. I didn't have a connection with my parents. Unfortunately, I didn't have a great connection with my older brother. My next brother was 11 years younger than me. The next one was 15 years younger, so I was taking care of them for at least for 3 to 5 years, or more actually, for about 7, until I left when I was about 19. So the loss of my grandmother was a huge trauma. So I've also worked with clients, Clifton, and some of them were yours that were referred to me, who lost a grandmother or lost an aunt or an uncle, and that person was their sense of safety, sense of security. Now, if you can pull up the next slide, I'd like to show you a little more about trauma.
Well, I have a comment on that slide though. So the first thing that was on there, I'll pull it back up again, was the first thing on there was physical abuse.
Yes.
Now, so for me, a while back, I had posted on Facebook, I think about a year or so ago, and I had said that in the Black community, we raise our children with shame. And so when most Black people around my age, maybe not the younger ones, because I don't know how we got away from it or not, but we grew up getting whippings. And with not only that, but we grew up being shamed, sit down and shut up, humiliate in public. But the thing is, it was made to be normal. And so I know that there are probably a lot of my guests on here who think that their childhood was normal because, well, I mean, that's just how, look at me. I'm not in jail. I'm running a company. I'm successful. It must have been good for me. Talk about how when you normalize trauma, you don't really address it, but then how does it still affect you?
All right, so you've raised a really good point, because in a moment we're going to talk about the health outcomes of trauma, and that's a really important part of this equation. Nonetheless, let's respond to your point, which is true. A lot of people, particularly if you go back 10, 20, 30, 40 years, were raised with physical beatings as a form of discipline. But what's the impact on the child? Now, you're going to laugh at this story, or you're going to go, this is absolutely bizarre, I don't believe you. So I grew up in a very strict religion, and my dad was very, very strict. It was black and white. You did wrong, you got hit. You did right, we'll leave you alone. We won't say anything. We won't praise you, but at least you won't get hit. I didn't realize till I was in my mid-20s that that was even abuse. I carried around a lot of anger, but I never said, oh yeah, I experienced abuse. No, I just thought, oh, my dad was very strict. But I never put two and two together. I never realized what the relationship outcomes, what the health outcomes were, or here's the best part, why I ran away from Australia. Mate, I didn't just go on a walkabout. Okay, so in Australia, we have the expression to go on a walkabout. A walkabout comes from the Aboriginal term, which means, they're constantly, they're traveling the country. And we'll say in Australia, oh, he's gone on a walkabout. And, he might disappear for a couple of weeks, a couple of days, maybe a vacation, maybe exploring. Well, for me, I went to the other side of the world and then I just stayed away. Now, if you asked me back then, Patrick, are you staying away because you're running away from something? Okay, what are you, nuts? No, I'm exploring the world. But later on, I went, oh, I'm actually running away. What am I running away from? Obviously, I was running away from what was an unhealthy environment, but I was also running away from myself. I was running away from my own pain. You can't run away from your own pain. And then when you start to have these weird symptoms, like I had for years and years, all of these liver problems. But I'm healthy. I exercise. I do lots of exercise. I eat healthy. I thought, generally speaking, my thoughts are healthy. Why do I have these liver and digestive problems? Well, the answer is in the 1998 study of the adverse childhood experiences, which linked even liver disease and hepatitis to childhood trauma. And in a moment, we're going to talk about those health outcomes. But I want to make a point that sometimes we don't know how that event has actually impacted us. And I've had this experience with so many clients, whereby, for example, a client says she's having problems and she's reacting to her husband touching her, and she just flips the switch and shuts down or freezes or feels really uncomfortable or afraid. And I asked her a couple of questions and I said, did anyone ever touch you when you were a child and it was an unwanted touch? She said, yes. Well, when did it begin? Age 5. And as we go back using my process, subconscious rapid transformation technique, the emotions come up. So this woman as an adult hadn't recognized the impact of this one incident. It was just one time. And the boy was, I believe, about 9 years older than her. And he actually placed his finger inside her. And I said, that's penetration, that's sexual battery, that's rape, particularly when the boy is 9 years older than you. But above all, when we went back there, she identified the emotions and the beliefs that she created as a result of that single traumatic incident.
That is the thing, the beliefs that you develop. So, I tell people, we look at the crackhead and we know his life went sideways. But when you're successful in running a company, you don't think that. But the beliefs that you've developed from this, I don't know if you remember, but we were talking one day. We wasn't even doing a session. We were talking and I asked you a question about my childhood. And long story short, when we got to the end of it, I discovered, if I'm 48, I discovered around 45, 46 that I was molested as a kid. I had no idea. And then again,
but that was not a false memory. You remembered it, correct?
I remembered it, but I never labeled it that.
Oh.
Until you asked me, even while we were talking, I didn't. Until you asked me, well, what if it was your son? And I got angry. And you were like, well, why are you angry? But then the beliefs that came from it, when you told me, because we weren't doing a session, you said what this kid would may believe about himself. You said may believe. I was able to look back over my entire life, all the way back to elementary school, and see the handprints of that molestation on every single relationship. That blew my mind because, again, I wasn't living what I thought a traumatic life, but my beliefs about me and how it relates to women and sex was heavily impacted, and I was clueless. Because I wanted to say this too, a lot of men, because in our culture, sex is good. And so if you have a lot of partners, it's not a bad thing. There may be trauma that you're missing, that you're not dealing with. So,
Well, Well, yes, and of course, if you're a child and someone more than 5 years older than you is engaging in some sort of sexual contact, that's unwanted, and then that leads to child abuse. I also have many clients who it started at age 8. This is a very bizarre thing that I'm going to share with you. It's a pattern that I identified after working with many clients who are the victims of sexual abuse. I'm talking about female clients who are adults. And they would tell me the story that it started around age 8 and went on till 13 or 14, sometimes to 15, but it was always around age 8 to about 13 by a stepdad, sometimes by the father, but often by the stepfather. And what's extraordinary about that is the impact that it has on the person. And this girl would get sexually abused on a regular basis almost every day for 5 to 7 years. And then we say, how does this happen? Not in terms of how was it hidden, but how did this happen in terms of the impact it has on the child? So now let's talk about the health outcomes, because this is the key. You mentioned beliefs, and we do formulate beliefs such as, I'm dirty. If you've experienced sexual abuse, I'm dirty. What I want doesn't matter. I can't ask for what I want. You become a people pleaser. You can't set boundaries, etc. So there's the beliefs that need to be changed. There's the emotions that need to be released. And we have to revive that sense of safety and security. The health outcomes are all impacted by the trauma because the trauma does the following. Let me put it this way. You're in a forest and you encounter a bear. What's going to happen? Your brain works instantly and registers the bear as a perceived threat. Now there's a signal. The HPA axis is triggered. That's the hypothalamic, pituitary, and adrenal gland axis are now working together to do everything that they need to do to keep you safe, because you're either going to fight that bear or you're going to run for your life. That means your body releases adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Your blood starts pumping, your heart starts pumping blood really fast. Your blood pressure rises, cortisol is released, your pupils dilate, and all of the blood is rushing to your outer limbs, your fists and your hands, so you can either fight or run. Now your immune system shuts down and your digestion either comes to a complete stop or slows down. Your entire body is ready to fight or flight, ready to fight or flee, or you could be so frozen by the fear that you actually feign death. Now, that's okay because it's a bear. But what happens if you are coming home, you're a little girl or a little boy, and you're coming home every day to that bear? That means you're coming home every day to a perceived threat, to a monster. So every day that you come home from school or from wherever, and you enter the house, maybe your dad's an alcoholic, so he doesn't hit you every day, but there's a chance he might hit you. The moment that you come into that house, or you're getting close to that house, up comes the feelings, and those feelings are your brain releasing all of these chemicals to put you in the fight or flight state. That's hyper alert, hyper arousal. Adrenaline, noradrenaline, epinephrine, norepinephrine are all fantastic chemicals when you need to run away. But when you're experiencing them on a daily basis, they are deadly, they are poison. That's what we call toxic stress. Over a prolonged time, you're re-experiencing that hyperarousal state. Now, all of those chemicals and that trauma also affects your brain. If you're a child developing, it affects your social development, it affects your cognition, and it affects your brain. And what they found over decades of study is the trauma will constantly activate the amygdala, which makes you more fearful and more aggressive. And it enlarges the amygdala, but it shrinks other parts of your brain. In fact, only about 8 years ago, they discovered that chronic stress shrinks the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is your executive decision maker. That's what you use to control impulses. But the prefrontal cortex is also involved in memory and learning. So when it comes time to draw a diagram or to work out a mathematical equation, there's a certain part of your brain that you use. But if you've experienced trauma, you're not able to use that part of the brain. I've got to end a call. So you still there?
Frozen? You're frozen.
Yeah.
I don't know if you came
Sorry.
back.
Hold on. Are you with me? Sorry.
Yes,
people are calling me. So what happens is when we find children that are not able to perform well at school, we have to look at their history of trauma. One particular doctor who's leading this movement, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, looked into this, and she reveals that even with ADHD, there are so many children who have a long history of trauma. So the trauma affects our health outcomes. Then it affects things such as substance abuse and addiction. And you say, well, how does that work? This is going to be a little surprising. But many, many years ago, probably decades, long before I ever studied anything to do with trauma, anything to do with addiction, to me, it seemed like common sense. And I would say, addiction? Well, that's pretty simple to understand. The people are engaging in substance, in the abuse of substances or behaviors because they're trying to escape a pain, or because they're already so numb, they're trying to feel something. It's the concept, not that they want to necessarily get high and experience pleasure, but they want to escape the pain and the past and the trauma. Lo and behold, when I went to a rehab clinic, I ended up working in a rehab clinic. When I said this to the director, she was stunned. And I went, why would you be stunned? Isn't this common sense? Well, if you go back even further to 1985, there was a doctor in a clinic in San Diego who was working with patients who were 100 to 500 pounds overweight. And what he noticed was that he had lots of success with them losing weight. But as soon as they lost the weight, they would leave. That means as they're having success, they would withdraw from the program. And he said, this is bizarre. Why is this happening? So he started talking more to his actual patients. And he ended up asking a question of one patient along the lines of, what weight were you when you were first sexually active? And she said, 40 pounds. He said, 40 pounds? You were sexually active when you were 40 pounds? She begins to cry, drops her head in shame because she's feeling the pain. She says, I was 4 years of age when my dad started sexually molesting me. Now, he was smart enough to say there is a link between the outcome of obesity and the trauma. When he went on to present this at a medical symposium, they all laughed at him. They said to him, nah, this is BS. Because the medical field and even the psychological field was set in their ways. He then went to this other doctor and said, look, I've surveyed 300 of my patients and here's what we found. And he started making the link between the obesity, the emotions, and the trauma. And think too, that there are certain people that are raised by their parents. Imagine girls who are told by their mother, you're eating too much, you're getting fat, stop eating so much, don't take seconds, what are you doing? Then that person starts to also experience pain and starts to change their identity and experiences trauma. So this doctor then went, partnered up with another doctor, and they did a study with 17,500 adults, tracing their current medical condition and their trauma. So they go, here are all the medical outcomes, heart disease, lung disease, etc., hepatitis. Here are all the psychological issues they have. What are the traumas that they've experienced? Then they came up with the adverse childhood experience study and assessment. That's when they asked these 10 questions. Did you experience any of these traumas? And they realized the more traumas you have, the more unhealthy outcomes you'll have. And you can pull up one of the slides, because I think in this slide we talk about some of
Is
the
this
outcomes.
the likelihood or the one before this?
This is, well, this one is basically showing you that about 66% of people surveyed have experienced one trauma. And about 76% of people, of those people who've experienced trauma, have experienced, I think, over 4 traumas. Jump to the next slide and please read that quickly, Clifton, because I think this is very powerful.
Yeah, this is the likelihood. Like with trauma, 4 times more likely to be an alcoholic, 4 times more likely to develop a sexually transmitted disease, 4 times more likely to inject drugs, 3 times more likely to use antidepressant medication, 3 times more likely to be absent from work, 3 times more likely to experience, actually can't see that bottom one. I don't know what that one says.
It's probably heart disease and pulmonary disease.
Okay. 3 times more likely to have serious joint problems, 2.5 times more likely to smoke tobacco, 2.5 more times more likely to get hepatitis, and then 15 times more likely to commit suicide.
So now you understand how serious trauma actually is in terms of the way it affects our mind and our body. Now, let me take a break here to say there's a good chance that someone watching this, and maybe many people watching this, are already starting to feel something, because we're talking about something that has affected so many of us. So I want to take this moment to say, pause for a moment and recognize you can be healed. You don't have to relive pain to heal yourself of trauma or to be healed of trauma. Everything that you've experienced has impacted you, but above all, the brain is neuroplastic, or the brain is plastic. That means the brain is constantly reorganizing itself and growing based on what you're doing, to what you're exposed, and to what things you're engaging in. So trauma affects the brain. Stress affects the brain. So does meditation. So does yoga. So does learning. So does your focus of attention. So does therapy. So the beauty of it is that even though your brain has developed in this way that the trauma has impacted the brain, it can actually be healed. So when I'm working with clients who've experienced trauma, I make sure that as we do the process of subconscious rapid transformation technique, that you are not reliving the trauma. And I state it very clearly. You can't create new pathways in your brain whilst you're in the pain, whilst you're in the trauma. So we have to separate you from it. So I'm taking this moment to say that first, you've got to be aware what is trauma. Second, how does trauma affect you? What's the mechanism? And look at all the potential outcomes. Now we've got to say, well, how do we heal trauma, and what does it even mean to be healed? So I wanted to take the break to make sure that everyone understands that no matter how bad you feel in this moment, it's not permanent. Your brain can be healed. You can let go of the painful emotions. You can let go of the trauma, and you can change the beliefs, some of the beliefs that you talked about. For most of us, the beliefs are, I'm not safe, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, I'm not worthy, I don't belong, I'm an outsider, there's something wrong with me, my love is not valuable, I'm insignificant. That's sort of the core that we all experience, one way or another. Would you like me to read the longer list, and I can read it relatively fast, or skim through some of the additional consequences of trauma, just so that anyone that's watching this can say, oh, that makes sense. I isolate myself. I withdraw. I don't have much memory of my childhood. Or I have lots of nightmares and flashbacks. Or I'm constantly on hypervigilant. I'm always on the alert. Or I'm numb and I disassociate and I shrink. There's such a wide spectrum, and they're contradictory because they can go from the fight or flight, which creates the hyperarousal, to the opposite, which is the hypoarousal. And in between are all these things. So let me say this will shock you. When we said earlier about health outcomes, trauma can even lead to skeletal fractures. And that's what I said. I remember the very first time I studied this, I went, what? How how is this possible? How does a trauma that happened when I'm 4 or 5 years or 10 years of age potentially affect me as I get older or in between? How do I have these skeletal fractures?
Mm-hmm.
Because the stress system, when the body activates the stress system and the stress becomes toxic, the body is releasing cortisol. What does cortisol do? It prevents the absorption of calcium into the bones.
Mm-hmm.
It reduces bone density, and therefore there's a bone crack.
Mm-hmm.
So everything that we experience in our body is traceable to something.
Mm-hmm.
Trauma affects the way you sleep, and sleep is also an important part of healing. So again, I'm putting all this together for people to understand that when you look at these symptoms that you think don't make any sense, digestive problems, sleep problems,
Oh, that's just
nightmares, all of those go back to something. Our body reflects what is happening in our mind and our brain, and it can be healed. So what I realized long before I started working in addiction is that we all experience pain. The toxic stress creates this pain, or the pain comes from the trauma, and we look for ways to avoid the pain or trauma. That can be about addiction, it can be about impulsive behavior, it can be about compulsive behavior, it can be overeating, it can be about calorie restriction, it can be staying away from relationships, it can even be being a workaholic. Because you referenced a few times people who have career success. But what are they like inside the soul?
Mm-hmm.
Are you satisfied, or you think, I've got to do more? Mm-hmm. COVID-19 created so much more trauma for people because it stopped everything. And it said, who are you now? Mm-hmm. Who are you? Are you what you do? Who are you inside? What's your meaning? What's your purpose? And you can't keep running away. You can't keep distracting yourself with this party and this concert and this outing and this dinner and this restaurant and this job and this career. Now you're stuck, and here's the mirror. Look at yourself. So you want to ask something?
Yeah, well, so I was going to say, that's the thing. I just thought about that. Trauma, especially trauma in childhood, doesn't it affect your ability to like know who you are, like you have identity?
Yes.
So you attach your identity to things on the outside of you, and when that goes away, because I see it in my office all the time, it goes away, and now they don't know who they are.
I'm so sincerely grateful you brought this up, because this is about the sense of either feeling unreal, a disconnection from the body, or deeper, I don't know who I am, I don't know what my identity is, I don't have a meaning, I don't know who am I. And this is something that comes up for people who've experienced trauma. And as you rightly said, when COVID-19 hits and we're either quarantined or locked down, we have no job, we have no way of distracting, that question comes up. Who am I now? What am I supposed to be doing? What's my meaning? What's my purpose? So trauma also leads to a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. Think of a child that experienced a lot of abuse and could never escape it. You know that that child's going to grow up, well, I say you know as one knows, that the child is going to grow up with a sense of hopelessness and helplessness. Mm-hmm. Or they're going to have these outbursts of anger and aggression and not know where they're coming from. Mm-hmm. But they stem from childhood. Again, this can all be healed as long as we go back to the originating event. May I ask, do we have anyone that's asking questions before I talk about the actual healing component?
Yes, I have two questions. One of them says, can't trauma in childhood cause a child to be a perfectionist and over-excel?
Yes, another one, a great point. It can lead to being a workaholic or overachievement. As far as perfection is concerned, it can happen a couple of ways. Either one of your parents, whoever your caretaker was so critical and judgmental and expected perfectionism from you, even if they didn't say it, it was in their face, the way they looked at you, or the way that they spoke to you, that you took on a subconscious belief that said, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable unless I'm perfect. And then you keep trying. I've had clients, when I'm doing the SRTT process and we're connecting to those beliefs, they're saying, I have to do more. I have to be more. I have to keep trying. So yes, that can be part of it. Or you could have a situation, this is another example of trauma, where you are different to the rest of your siblings. Maybe the rest of your siblings are more like the average person and they love sport and they're very outgoing and perhaps they're extroverted, but you're the introvert. Or vice versa, your siblings are all introverted and you're the extrovert. And therefore, your parents, who might be more similar to your siblings, start looking at you like you're weird and there's something wrong with you. Why, Johnny, aren't you like your older brother or your younger brother or whatever? And they're comparing you. Then you create the belief again of, I need to be perfect. The next question?
The other one was, can one be affected by trauma as an adult and adversely be impacted?
Yes, for the same reasons. Okay, the reason that trauma is so much more impactful on a child is because the child's brain is developing and the child is developing socially. So as their body is growing and as their brain is developing, the trauma is going to impact their endocrine system, their hormonal system, their digestive system, their immune system, and of course their brain system, the cerebral, the brain itself. As an adult, trauma will also affect you, because think of the person that had a traumatic car accident or the car accident and they say, I can never drive again. I don't feel safe to drive again. So yes, because trauma ultimately creates an extreme stress response, and then the mind has a beautiful way of doing its best to protect you. So what the mind will do is, let's say you got burnt from a fire. Every time you see a flame, your brain will go, whoops, be careful. That could be danger. But sometimes the brain doesn't say, be careful. It just says danger. I've drowned almost 7 times, and it's very easy for me to almost get triggered again of potentially drowning. So there are times, even a year ago, when I was almost drowning and I had to use my brain, my mind, to say, breathe deeply, relax, you are safe. So yes, you can experience trauma in adulthood. And I mean, we can't just brush it away and say a woman who's 26 or 36 who gets raped isn't going to experience any trauma. Trauma happens at every age. It's just much more impactful the younger you are.
One more. Can you outgrow trauma? Like a traumatic event only happened one time in childhood, but it was really traumatic. And then once, that's over, can you outgrow that if you never do therapy or anything?
That's a great question, and it's something that I was planning to talk about, and I'm glad you brought it up. 2 things here. Resiliency. So let's answer the question this way. You have 2 siblings, and they both experience physical abuse, and it's quite serious abuse. One grows up, and his life is an extraordinary mess. The other brother isn't in such a mess. They're both negatively impacted, and we say we can trace it. But why was one more impacted than the other? Was it personality? Was it temperament? Was it nature? No. What it actually was nurture. In the sense, think about your childhood as you're watching this webinar. I didn't ask these questions, but I'll just ask a few. Did you feel loved as a little child? Did you feel loved by your mum? Did you feel loved by your dad? Did you feel loved at all? Was there someone in your life as you were growing up who believed in you, who comforted you? Was there someone in your life as you were growing up whom you could turn to when you felt sad, or you felt bad, or you felt angry, or you felt lost? Here I'm referring to some sort of support network. So even if you experienced abuse in childhood, but you had some sort of support network, then you'll have more resiliency, and that will help you to go through the trauma or to outgrow the trauma. I don't know if I personally would say that you outgrow a trauma, because I would need to know, what was this horrific trauma you experienced? And then I would need to ask you questions to see, did you form some subconscious beliefs as a result of that trauma? some that you're maybe not consciously aware of, but they play out in your life and in your relationships. So again, it's all about when you experience trauma, there's extreme stress. And if once that's ended, it takes about 20 minutes for your body to come back to what we call baseline or homeostasis. If you have chronic trauma, you have chronic stress, you can never go back to baseline. If you have someone that's comforting you, then you're able to go back to baseline and you experience less trauma. And unless you have another question, I wanted to talk about the window of tolerance. Do you have another question?
Let me see, make sure. How is it that my trauma?
Well, you can read it.
Oh yeah. My question is, how is that my trauma sought out a spouse even worse with, basically, I think I know what they're saying. How did my trauma attract me to my spouse who has more trauma?
Okay, so this is a bizarre thing. Again, this is from research, and we found that people that were abused as a child were more likely to be abused again and again and again. And this, now, please pause and listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. This is not blaming you. This is not victim blaming. I'm not saying it's your fault. I'm saying understand that it's actually normal, that if you experienced abuse, you will find yourself in more relationships of abuse. I did the same thing. And I noticed pattern after pattern, partner after partner, that she had no interest in my emotional needs. Not that I even asked for them, but I went, how did this happen? Oh, because of my own subconscious beliefs, because we create an identity, a subconscious identity for ourselves and a subconscious energy. And the way that we even relate to the way that we handle stress will determine the kind of people we attract and the kind of people to whom we're attracted. So for example, let's say your attachment style, that means when you're in a relationship, the way you respond is you're very anxious, you're very clingy and needy, and you're constantly concerned about the relationship. And did you screw up? There's very little chance that you're going to end up with someone that's of a secure attachment style, because you don't realize the ways that you are drawing to those people, or those people are being drawn to you. Again, this isn't blaming you, but it's not on you. And I guess it's also important to say most of us, I think it's about 4 out of 5 people have experienced trauma, and it doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter whether you're black, white, Australian, or from wherever you're from. Everyone's experienced some form of trauma, or 4 out of 5 people have. And the point here is that lots of people have experienced trauma, but recognize what is the energy that you give off. And what I mean by that, I don't mean some airy fairy, color field around you. I'm not saying that's not true. I'm just saying I'm not talking about that. But rather, when you show up, when you speak, when you stand, your tone of voice, the way that you respond to a text message, an email, the way you respond to someone who talks to you, what are you giving off? What are the subconscious messages you're giving off? Yeah. And Clifton, you said it before we started this program. Do you want to mention that or not?
As far as what part? What?
Giving and getting.
Oh, when I was saying about, I can't remember. Tired of giving, when I was talking about that?
Yeah, 3 hours ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was in a state where I felt like I was, my clients, y'all don't shoot me, right? I was tired of doing therapy because I'm like,
that's okay.
Nobody listens to me. But then when I said that, I was like, well, wait a minute. And that's why, because I've learned to catch thoughts too. And I said, nobody listens to you. I said, that sounds like it's coming from somewhere else. And, sure enough, I believe it went back to my childhood. So then we were talking about what we were talking about. And I said, hey, I think I'm actually being triggered right now. So yeah, right. That was a conversation.
Now, there was another point you made that, with your permission, if I may address. You also said to me, I give and I never get.
Yes. Yeah, that was the basis of the no one listens. But yeah, it was, I give and I never get. And
so let me jump in. This is very important. This is a subconscious belief,
Yes.
which is part of your identity. So
Mm-hmm.
your identity is I give, but I never get. And part of that belief is probably I give, but I'm not going to expect to get. And then as an adult, you start to feel really frustrated and pissed off
Mm-hmm.
because you're not getting.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore, you're saying your subconscious identity is playing out. Now, let me say this, having known you for 4 years, I actually already know that about you.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, there is something about you give very unselfishly in a way that I've not very rarely experienced.
Mm-hmm.
You give from your heart. You really care. You really sincerely love your patients. You want to help them.
Help me to breathe.
And this will just receive it because you're getting it. Although that's not the point yet. But you're a person that really does care. And you don't think about yourself. You think about how to help other people. So you're always coming from a spiritual perspective, which is an open heart. That's the spiritual perspective, connecting and giving from the heart. But I have always sensed that you don't expect anything in return.
Mm-hmm.
So I have to Patrick Wanis, have to catch myself out and say, wait a minute, whoa. You better give something back to this guy because he's just going to keep giving and he's never going to ask for anything.
And
but hold on, this is important. Okay, I read that about you. So that's something that you've been giving off without even knowing it. But because I'm vigilant, and I go, Patrick, you better give back to this guy because otherwise he's just going to give, which isn't symbiotic. Two organisms, two people mutually benefiting each other. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, I was just going to say, it's right in line with everything that you're saying. I can absolutely look back and see how I've always attracted the people who were not available or couldn't give me, and then I'd be frustrated and fussing. Why won't you give? Because that subconscious energy attracted what I believed I deserved. So yeah.
Here's the other important point to answer that person's question about the kind of people we attract. We also respond to people that remind us of our primary caretakers. We become more responsive to them. Mm-hmm. I noticed this in my very early 20s, and I went, what the heck is going on? One minute, I'm attracting this tall, slender girl who's so bubbly and lively, but quite cold and callous, mm-hmm. or distant or very self-absorbed, which incidentally was like my mother. Mm-hmm. And then the next minute, I'm attracted to a girl that's very short and plumpy and so warm and loving and affectionate, like my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. I went, okay, am I nuts? And this was long before I studied any of this. And then I realized we respond mm-hmm. to people. We become more responsive because that was our definition of love. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I've used the term twisted definition of love. The way that your parents give you attention will become your definition of love. So if you get negative attention, you'll have a negative concept of love. You'll have a twisted definition of love. So again, there's our self-image, our self-concept, our self-identity that we put out, and then we also respond to people that are similar and will complement or keep alive our subconscious beliefs. Mm-hmm. So if I sincerely, subconsciously believe that I deserve to be treated well, I'm not going to respond to anyone that doesn't treat me well.
Right.
I might not even notice them. Or I'll go, oh, okay. So I used to respond to those people that didn't treat me well. Mm-hmm. Lo and behold, I did the work that I needed to do. Now I'm not triggered by the people that don't treat me well, and I'm definitely not attracted to them. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You've got to change your subconscious beliefs. Before I talk more about the healing, because I know we're a little over, do you have any more questions? Because I really want to answer people's questions, because this is the way that I think the great information comes out.
Let's see. Are there ways you can avoid or minimize how your trauma affects your relationship?
Yes. And this might need to be the next part 2, but I'll probably write a newsletter about it. It's about resiliency. You've got to do 2 things, and this is a great point. Number 1, you've got to work on healing the actual trauma. So Healing the trauma with my process, subconscious rapid transformation technique,
Mhm.
is about identifying and validating all of the emotions that you experienced at that time, then going through the process to release all of those emotions, then identifying the beliefs that you attached and associated to that trauma or that event and changing them, and then recognizing that you're safe and secure, and then working on your conscious daily behaviors. So that means resiliency. Resiliency is your ability to bounce back
Mhm.
from setbacks, disappointments, failures, trauma, or whatever.
Mhm.
But it's not, if you see someone who you perceive to be more resilient, that's probably because they grew up with a greater social support network.
Mhm.
And therefore, they also had a greater belief in themselves.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, resiliency is the key to helping you to consciously deal with trauma. And we can talk about this in a future seminar, a future webinar, or I'll write an article or both,
Mhm.
because there's quite a few steps to resiliency. But at least understand what resiliency is. It's your ability to bounce back, and to bounce back with new wisdom and new understanding, so you feel even stronger.
Okay.
Another question?
Yep. Let's see. Can you talk a bit about cancer or COVID? A cancer PTSD, cancer caregiver PTSD, especially after the patient passes away.
So, if I understand this question correctly, this is a person who's taken care of someone who had cancer and died, and
Mhm.
now if it's not trauma, there's a deep sense of loss. But it could be traumatic because it depends what your relationship was, how
Mhm.
long you were, what part of your identity that was, if you were a parent, or if you were the husband or the partner, or if you were the child taking care of your parent for 10, 15, 20 years.
Mhm.
And maybe you even feel guilty for having survived while they
Mhm.
passed away. So I would need to ask you more questions, but first recognize that it's okay to feel whatever you feel. And any time in your life that there's a loss of a loved one, even if you're a doctor taking care of a patient, I had a psychiatrist call me and say, Patrick, I'm struggling because one of my patients committed suicide. So I have to attend to him as well.
Mhm.
And it's not unusual. The point is, you're allowed to feel whatever you feel. And when there's death, there's loss, there's
Mhm.
grief, there's pain, there's hurt. Accept that it's okay. Now begin to be compassionate to yourself. And I don't mean in the new age, airy fairy way. There
Mhm.
are practical things you can do, starting off with writing out what you're actually feeling. And don't judge yourself for those feelings, even if you're feeling guilty that you survived and the other person died.
Mhm.
Just say, it's okay that I'm feeling this. It's human to feel this wide spectrum of emotions, from
Mhm.
pain to ecstasy. Then from there, ask yourself, if I were taking care of my friend who just had this experience, what would I do for them?
Mhm.
How would I listen to them? And since you've been the caregiver for someone else, are you able to receive? Most nurses, most caregivers struggle with receiving. I did a workshop for Shell Health, and I focused on that because a lot of the people in that were actually nurses. And I didn't even know what departments they were in. A lot of them were doctors and PhDs and engineers. And I remember saying to them once, just as we went around the room it was at the beginning of the day. And I'd like to believe that I'm relatively good at reading people just by looking at them. And I said to this lady, you give a lot, you're great at giving, but you're no good at receiving. And she started crying immediately. How could you know this? And I said, it's what I read from you.
Mhm.
So if you're a caregiver or a nurse, you're constantly accustomed, you've programmed yourself to take care of everyone else. Allow someone to take care of you. And if you want someone to take care of you, you've got to ask for help. You've got to be
Mhm.
willing to ask for help.
Mhm.
That's vulnerability. But you can't make real connection unless you're willing to be vulnerable.
I like what you told me. You told me this long ago. You said, if you really believe that it's more blessed to give than receive, then allow someone else to be blessed and give to you, because you're always giving out. Allow someone else to be blessed and give to you. And I was like, huh, that's a good point. And it really helped me.
And this is the bizarre thing. When you call someone up and you say, listen, I'm having a hard time, would you just listen? I need someone to listen. Not only are you building a deeper, more authentic connection with this person, but you're making the other person feel significant because now they know they're needed. Now they know they can help you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the blessing that they get because they're giving to you. You're giving them the blessing of giving to you.
Yeah, true.
Any other questions?
Let's see. Um, I read that one. Where's my mouse disappeared? Okay, there it is. No, that's not it. Maybe my battery's low. Here we go. Oh wow.
You got lots of questions?
Several questions. Let's see. Where was our last? Um,
Let's go through them because I think that's really important.
if you have a parent who dotes on you, can it give you unrealistic needs in your adult life?
Well, yes, I would need to ask you the question, how do you respond to that doting? Perhaps you feel that um, you're not capable. As a result of your parent doting on you, you might feel, you would obviously say things like, oh, I feel strangled or I feel suffocated, I can't breathe. But what other impact does it have on you? Does it mean that you don't believe in your capabilities? Does it mean that you push people away? Does it mean that you don't trust people because you think that they don't think you're capable? So ask yourself, how does that doting affect me?
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to get a little clearer, imagine that you're next to you, and let's say that the person asking the question is Mary, and you say, how does Mary respond to being doted on by her mother? And you might say, well, it drives her nuts. Okay, so she gets frustrated by it. How does it affect her? What does she believe about herself? Well, she thinks that her mother thinks she's stupid and incapable. Or she thinks that her mother doesn't see her as a whole person, doesn't see her as a actualizing adult, etc. So dig a little deeper to ask yourself, how does it really affect you?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Next question.
Let's see. Are you able to have forgiving and healthy relationship in the long term with someone who abused you? That's a good question.
Yes. It may not be easy, but you can get there. I was trying to work out whether to use the word easy or simple.
Mm-hmm.
I will speak from my experience. Now, I've done this in SRTT with so many clients who are abused, and by dad, by mum, different forms of abuse, some psychological, some emotional, some verbal, some physical, and they were still able to heal the relationship through forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe that you can just do it by saying, oh, I forgive you.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've had clients who came to me saying, I thought I forgave them, then I realized I didn't.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Forgiveness occurs when you understand that the person that hurt you was already hurting themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Forgiveness occurs when you understand that the person that created pain in you was in pain themselves. Forgiveness occurs when you truly understand that that person didn't set out to hurt you, they were already in pain. Forgiveness for me occurred when I recognized that my mother wasn't able to love. It's not that she didn't love me. It's not that she didn't want to love me. She wasn't actually able to love.
Right.
And that's it. That's just the way it works. But it's not something that happens consciously. In the process that I do, we're accessing the subconscious mind so you feel it. You really can connect with that, even though you don't want to connect with the abuser. You connect and you see who that person is.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing happened with my father because my father was very abusive. Now, the blessing, not for me, but for other members of my family, was that by the time my father became older, he softened.
Mm-hmm.
As he softened, he became more of his authentic self. He lived more from his heart.
Mm-hmm.
But he also suffered the trauma. He suffered the results and the consequences of his childhood trauma, of his beatings, of the fact that he didn't get physical love and affection from his mother, from the fact that he didn't get his emotional needs met from his mother, from the fact that he married someone just like his mother who couldn't love him and didn't love him.
Mm-hmm.
So then he ended up with heart attacks and stroke.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
But the point is, in those last years of his life, he was able to express love to other people in my family, such as my niece or my nieces. And I remember thinking, this is a real blessing, because this man beat the hell out of me. I couldn't walk sometimes. I couldn't sit down. I couldn't raise my hands from the beatings that my father gave me. But here he is expressing love to my niece. I was grateful for that.
Yeah.
And then she experienced trauma when he passed, because he was one of her social supports. The point is that I was able to forgive him when I connected to the pain that he experienced. When I imagined him as a child not getting the love that he wanted. When I imagined him as a child getting beaten by his father. When I imagined him as a child and his, what in America they call diapers, in Australia we call nappies, were not changed by his mother because she had servants. She didn't want to touch his bottom. She paid other people to do that. But the child needs the physical love and touch of the mother. So if the mother's like my grandmother was, and she says, I don't do that, and she pays a servant, the child suffers. If the mother is in depression or is suffering from substance abuse and is doing cocaine or something else, and doesn't give that physical love and affection and connection to the child suffers trauma. So yes, you can forgive, and this will probably be the most important thing I'm going to say to you tonight. Focus on forgiving, because that is a key part of setting you free from the trauma, and it will release a lot of the poison and the pain that's in your heart. Next question.
That's good. Real quick, sometimes I tell my clients the thing that you just described. There's actually a movie called The Shack, and it really.
Oh, I heard about this. Go
on. This guy who was beat by his alcoholic father, and then his daughter is murdered, and he has a situation with God, Holy Spirit, and Jesus, and they're trying to make him forgive. And the picture of his dad shows up as a kid. And I'm like, man, this is SRTT. It's a really powerful movie.
That's great.
Yeah. So, okay, next question. How do you identify your trauma if you have learned to push off or minimize situations? And I believe they're saying like, okay, I may have trauma, but I don't know what it is because I'm used to pushing stuff away.
Well, two things, and I think we need to share this. Either we go over it again or they go back to the beginning. I identified at least 12 different forms of childhood trauma. Were you physically abused? Did your parents shout at you, insult you, or humiliate you? Did your parents neglect you emotionally? Did someone or anyone, when you were a child, did someone sexually abuse you? Did one of your parents have mental illness?
Or dad not being there, right?
Or dad not being there? Was someone suicidal? Was someone incarcerated? Et cetera, et cetera. So look at all of those things. And if you're talking about pushing it away, the only reason you've pushed it away is because it was too painful to watch. It was too painful to visit. But you can visit it if you have the right person and the right technique helping you, because then you're able to visit it without reliving any pain. And I'll say it again, you can't heal trauma when you are reliving the pain or reliving the trauma. The work that I do is so that you are out of the trauma, but you're looking at it and you're able to have compassion for that child that experienced the trauma.
And I think, because I think I know this person, and they're saying they push everything away. Like they minimize situations. So when something bad happens to them, it's not that bad. But,
okay. So that simply means that most likely the parents did the same thing, that the parents never acknowledged what you were feeling. No one ever said to you, what do you feel? What do you want? What do you need? So no one connected to your thoughts, emotions, or desires. Perhaps no one ever said to you, who are you? What excites you? Or I see you playing with this toy. Is this something you really like? Is this what you want to do later in school? What's your passion? So if they didn't connect to you and they didn't ask you what you want, then you probably felt unimportant, and therefore you thought whatever I feel, whatever I experience isn't important, and you push it all away. And perhaps it might have also been a case of a household where it's better left unsaid, or dad was stoic in the sense of dad showed no emotion,
Mm-hmm.
or parents said, doesn't matter. Why are you feeling afraid? Stop that.
Mm-hmm.
Why are you angry? Stop that. So they teach you, shut down your emotions. What you feel is insignificant. So again, look at the way you were raised.
This is a good one. If you experience severe childhood trauma, but now as an adult, you feel nothing when you think about it, does that mean you have moved on from that trauma?
I wish that were true.
I could
All
say
that.
that.
What did you want to say?
I'm just
You want
saying,
to
my answer is short, and it's just no, because that was me until I did work, and I was like, oh, I didn't know all that was in there. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that look at it this way. What's the effect in your life? How are your relationships? How do you feel day to day? If you say it doesn't affect you or that you don't feel any pain if you think about it, you probably shut it down. There are people who say, I don't have many memories as a childhood. There are people like I did. I mean, I would say, yeah, I got hit as a child. I didn't think it meant anything to me. But whoa, let me tell you one experience when there was someone, when I finally said, oh, I think that I need some help here because I'm a bit of a mess. And this person started taking me back. And that was an awful mistake because this person is a beautiful person, but didn't have the technique or the tools to know what to do with me. When I went back to that, I went into the most bizarre state. And I went in, and you're not going to believe this. Imagine an adult who on the sofa goes into a fetal position. This person left me there because they had to. They were actually, it was a home visit. I lay in that fetal position for 3 hours. Wow. And then I lay in bed for a couple of days because the person didn't have a process or a technique. They took me back, not expecting me. They knew what I'd experienced, I told them, but I went back to that and boom. So if you think that you're saying, well, I think about that trauma, but I don't feel anything, what about your physical body? What manifestations? What's your sleep like? What's your digestion like? Do you have any other physical symptoms? Mm-hmm. How do you relate to people? How do you feel about yourself? Do you have any heart problems, any liver problems, any digestive problems, any immune problems? Are you overweight? Are you motivated? Do you feel alive? Do you feel happy? Look at your entire person, because you are a whole person. Mm-hmm. Life is lived in 4 realms: mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual. Mental is your thought, your cognitive abilities. Emotions are the things you feel and the way you relate to people. Physical is your body and everything that's tangible. Spiritual is your connection to either a higher power or at least to other human beings, in the sense of, are you coming from the heart? Are you living from the heart? Are you contributing and making a positive difference? Mm-hmm. 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 And, oh, here's a good one. Mm-hmm. There's a reason you came to listen to this webinar, because at a subconscious level, you know that needs healing.
Mm-hmm. Another one, I meet people a lot of times who don't trust, but because they are married to an imperfect human who has done something to break their trust, they think it's because of them. But then as we do work, no, you actually brought that distrust with you. They may have made it worse, but a lot of times I think because of who we have in our lives, it prevents us from looking at ourselves, because we'll say, no, I'm this way because you are treating me such and such. And that's just not true. But it makes it difficult to see you.
So that's another good point, because that's another one of the consequences of trauma, where it's very easy for a person that's experienced trauma not to trust. I was like that most of my life. I just didn't trust anyone because I never trusted anyone growing up. And the only person I really trusted, I had a good relationship with 2 of my grandmothers. One of them died on me. Now, notice the expression, died on me. Mm-hmm. Right? That's the child speaking. Mm-hmm. My grandmother died on me. She didn't deliberately die. She was old. She was sick. And the other grandmother, I had a good relationship up until she did something, which I won't talk about on this video. Mm-hmm. So therefore, I didn't trust anyone. And from the time that my maternal grandmother died, my mother and father turned to me to be the rock for them. My mother actually said those words to me: don't cry, you're my tower of strength. So it flipped. Mm-hmm. So I never learned to trust people. It was very hard for me to ask for support. Mm. So look at it, the point again being trauma will also create a sense of either hypervigilance, or I don't trust anyone, I don't feel safe trusting anyone, I have an inability to trust or resistance to trust. That's
Mm-hmm.
because the people that were supposed to take care of you and protect you and love you and nurture you and provide you and give you a sense of safety, security, and stability betrayed your trust and made you feel unsecure. And particularly for a child, if that's the father, because the father's role, the father's primary role is to protect. Because think of the way the child looks up to the man who has a deep voice, and to the child, the depth of that voice represents safety and security, as well as the size and the way that the man moves through the space. And now he's abusing the child either physically or sexually.
Mm.
So the person that's supposed to be protecting the child has removed the protection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Next question.
So let's see. Uh, for example, an extremely secure, reliable, loving, and overly attentive and supportive guardian who always made you feel special and important. And oh, I guess that was for the doting one. But here's the second part, I guess. Can someone have a parent like this, but still be suffering from trauma they experienced earlier in life?
So if I understand the question correctly, you have a parent that was a really great parent and took care of you, took care of your emotional needs,
Uh-huh.
but there's some other trauma you experienced. So what was that trauma? Was it someone else outside the family, or a relative, or a stepdad who sexually abused you? You still have to deal with that trauma. And let me tell you the good news and the bad news. The good news, it can be healed. The bad news is that there'll also be anger towards the mother. Meaning, if you're a child, if you're a daughter, if you're a girl, and as a child, you were sexually abused by either your father, stepfather, or a relative or a neighbor, there's a 99% chance you're also going to be angry at your mother for failing to protect you.
Okay. I have more details. He added something else before. I didn't read this. So
Oh,
it's um, I had a very I had a very loving relationship with a step parent, and I think it has made it difficult to recognize past trauma. I felt ashamed for having emotional problems because I had such support and love from age 7 onwards.
oh, good.
Yeah, you got it. Okay.
This is so important, and I'm glad you brought this up. Thank you very, very much, sincerely, because it was something I was planning to talk about. I was having a discussion with a friend who experienced trauma as a child. Now, this particular person travels the world and is often in war-torn areas. So she says to me, Patrick, how can I look at my trauma when I go over there and I see their trauma is so much more extreme than anything I experienced? And I say, it's very simple. You're now looking at the trauma from an adult perspective, and you're trying to compare and say, look, the trauma that I experienced as a child is a 5 out of 10, but over here, it's a 10 out of 10 because it's a war-torn area. But that's not what the child thought. Because when you're a child, you register the trauma. When you're a child and you're experiencing the trauma, you're not saying to yourself, ooh, someone on the other side of the world is having a worse experience than me. No, your brain is triggered. You've gone into the fight or flight response, and you are responding to the pain right now.
Mm-hmm.
So be careful of comparing yourself to anyone else and therefore saying, look, I feel guilty thinking about my first 7 years that were painful because I had a loving father or stepfather from age 7. No, you still had pain in the first 7 years, and that needs to be addressed. And please recognize 2 things. It's okay to have pain. It's okay to feel the pain as long as you have a process to heal you.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is what I said at the beginning. The first most important years that will determine the rest of your life are the first 2 years, then the first 6 years, then the first 8 to 10 years, then the first 18 years. So those first 2 years when you're an infant, you are developing your sense of safety, security with the world, your connection to a caretaker. And right in that moment, you're going to make a decision as a child, as an infant, about whether your emotional needs can be met. And if you're saying to me, Patrick, how is this possible with an infant? I will direct you to studies that were done You can look up John Bowlby's work, or you can look up The Strange Situation by Mary Ainsworth. Watch those videos and you will learn how the first 2 years change your life. So yes, if you've had trauma, even if you had someone else that was loving and kind and caring, still please go back and deal with that trauma. Heal it.
Good stuff. If someone feels like they've already forgiven those who have caused them trauma, what explains angry outbursts?
A couple of things. Potentially you might have forgiven them or you may not have. So first thing is, you're not really sure, but let's say in your heart you feel you've forgiven them. Maybe you have forgiven that person, but let's find out, where is the anger coming from? Is it from some neurological impact? As I said in the beginning of this program, chronic stress and toxic stress changes the amygdala. It can enlarge the amygdala, and the amygdala is what makes you hypervigilant, and therefore you'll see danger when there isn't any danger, and you'll have fear when fear isn't required, and you'll be aggressive when aggression isn't required. So that's another possibility. And number three, you might be angry at someone else. Maybe you've forgiven, and I'll use the example of a little girl who gets sexually abused by a stepdad or dad will actually be angrier at her mother than the person that abused her. So you might have forgiven the abuser, but have you forgiven other people associated with that? And have you actually forgiven yourself? What do I mean by that? It is the most common occurrence that every person who experiences trauma will subconsciously blame themselves. Doesn't matter whether you are 4, 6, 10, 26, 36, or 46. Whenever something is done to you, you will ask the question, why me? And you'll start to think it was because of you. And then if you're a girl, you'll say, did I do something? Did I send those signals? What was it about me that made him choose me to molest me, abuse me, rape me? And you'll blame yourself. So you might even be angry at yourself. You might be just angry at the fact that it happened. So there's all these beliefs, because there's also beliefs that I work with clients. Again, in the SRTT process, we uncover the client with a subconscious belief saying it wasn't fair. And so there's anger there. And I say to him, you're right, it wasn't fair, because you didn't do anything wrong. It wasn't your fault. You're not to blame. It wasn't fair. But sometimes in life, that's it. Now, what do you want to do about it? And if you are able to sit down with a child who's just experienced this right now, it's just finished, and you're calming and you're comforting the child, and 20 minutes has passed and the child's going back to baseline, all the stress response has dropped, and you say to the child, I know you're hurt, and you listen to what they're feeling and you help them to verbalize what they're feeling, even if they don't know how to put words to it, but you help them and you offer them words. And then you recognize that they believe it's unfair, and you say, that's right. You're right, it's unfair. I promise you 90% of that pain will dissipate, because you've acknowledged them and you understand them. You don't have to convince them that they're wrong and say, well, life is fair or life isn't fair. You just acknowledge that that's what they're thinking and feeling, and perhaps you guide them a little and you show them an insight and say, sometimes in life, unfair things happen and we don't have control over that. But there are things we do have control. We have control over the way we're going to respond. Next question.
This one is more of a comment. It says, I noticed a major shift in my daughter when her grandmother, her favorite person, passed when she was 9. She's 17 now and doesn't feel connected with anyone.
Okay, this sounds a little bit like my story. It happened at age 10. So I don't know if this person has heard my story, but let me say it makes complete sense, because for 2 reasons. One, children tend to have a better relationship with grandparents than parents, because by the time that person has become older, they've softened, and they have different expectations of the child. When you're a parent, you have one expectation of the child. It starts with the letter O. It's called obedience. You just want your child to be obedient and not drive you nuts. Then you have all the other expectations. But the grandparent comes along and the grandparent celebrates the child and makes the if the grandparent is healthy, and makes the grandchild feel loved and wanted and needed and special and magical and worthy. And the grandparent often puts in that child, notice I say puts in that child, the belief you can do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Then the grandparent's gone.
Mm-hmm.
The child loses all of those things that the child had.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the work that I do, I have to help the client, and I do help the client, to say, if your grandparent, your grandmother believed in you, what's changed? She may have gone in physical body, but her belief in you didn't change.
Mm-hmm.
She loved you for a reason. That hasn't changed. Fulfill her wishes. Her wishes were for you to live life to its fullest. Her wishes, your grandfather's wishes, were to enjoy life and to live life to the fullest. Your grandmother or grandparents saw all this beauty in you. Why do you want to bring out the ugliness? Why do you want to suppress the beauty? Bring out the beauty, prove to them that they were true. Don't prove to them that they were wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Prove to them that they were right. Mm-hmm. So yes, please talk to your 17-year-old daughter because she needs it. Because if that was her only connection, she's going to suffer a lot in relationships because she probably doesn't know how to connect, probably doesn't trust anyone, and is afraid that people will leave her. I know because I experienced it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, two more, last two. I was abused by a man and his sons, but I was very young and had very limited memories that I chalk up to dumb activities, but I don't believe it affected me. My brother and sister violated me, but I also chalk that up to dumb childhood stuff. My mother,
Okay. There's more. Sorry. Go
yeah,
ahead.
my mother has 8 children, and I don't fault her because she was supporting us as a single parent. My spouse feels that I have baggage, but we have moved on. But my
Okay.
spouse feels I haven't.
Well, the first question would be, why does your spouse think that? What is it about your relationship that your spouse identifies there's some connection to what you experienced? Is it in the way that you two are physically and sexually intimate? Is
Mm-hmm.
it the sense of trust that maybe he doesn't get from you? Maybe he senses that you don't trust, that you don't fully open up? Is there some other sort of sexual block? Because for women, 80% of orgasm is the sense of safety. A woman's orgasm is connected directly to a sense of, do I feel safe? Can I trust? Can I let go? So what is it that your husband's seeing in you that says, you have baggage, honey? You need to deal with this. And then when you tell me a story, such as I got violated by my, I don't know if he was father or stepfather, and siblings and other people, there's no way that you weren't affected by this because you're a human being. And even if you're looking at it as an adult and saying, it's a long time ago, it's in the past, I don't feel anything, you do at a deeper level because that little girl was hurt and violated. And the same thing that I said to Clifton when he and I were talking about this, I'll say to you. If you're a mother and that were happening to your child, how would you think? How would you feel? How would you react? Would you just say to her, don't worry about it, they're just dumb activities? Would you say, don't worry, there's 7 siblings, forget about it? No, you wouldn't. You would recognize the pain and the impact. And again, if you're still unsure, go to patrickwanis.com/blog and read my article that I wrote about trauma and its lifelong consequences and impact on health outcomes. And I promise you, you will have some of these symptoms.
Okay, good stuff. That's good. And so actually, so this last question, I didn't know if we would be able to even get to this in this particular session, but I think this question leads right into some answers. So, how do you live with? Wait a minute. Did I miss the question? I did because I didn't see that one. I'm sorry, Lucy. I didn't see your question, but because of time, I'm gonna read this other one. I really apologize because I've answered a couple of yours anyway. Okay, don't fault me. If you really need it, I'll email you. I'll have Patrick email you the answer. So let's see. This was the last one I was thinking of. What the heck? Let's go for it. This is Lucy's. How do you live with someone who is verbally abusive and will probably never change due to suspected mental illness that he or she will not address?
It's obviously a very tough choice, and you've got to ask yourself, how many years do I have left? How do I want to live them? I know that sounds very cold and very black and white. Sometimes we have to make really tough choices in life. Sometimes there isn't a good and a bad. There's just which is the less painful choice.
Yeah.
And so if you are with someone who has a mental illness and they're not willing to get any help, or you're with someone who you know is abusive and you're convinced for whatever the reasons are, they're not going to change, then you ask yourself, how do I want to live the rest of my life? And then you ask yourself, if that were my daughter, what would I tell her? Would I tell her to stay? Would I tell her, you've got to love yourself, you've got to respect yourself? Because a lot of people make this mistake, Clifton. They stay in relationships that are unhealthy, and all it does is it harms both people. It's not helping the abuser that you're with him.
Right.
If he's just being abusive, it's not like you're healing him. It's not like you're making him feel any better, because trust me when I tell you, he doesn't feel any better for the abuse that he lays out on you.
Right.
So you're not helping anyone.
True. Okay.
Last question.
Yep. In our last 5 minutes, it says, now that you know you've experienced one or more traumatic experiences and are suffering from them, how to choose the right professional with the right tools to help you deal with the trauma and its effects on you?
Well, you come to me. So here are the two most important things. Number one, can you trust this person? Just follow your gut. Put your hand on your heart and ask yourself, can I trust this person? Be careful that you're not just coming from a place of fear. But I remember saying that once to a client. My client put me on the phone with a potential new client, and I normally never, ever do that. But she begged me, she said, Patrick, please talk to so-and-so for 5 minutes. Okay, I'll do it. And I said to her, and I talked to her for 5 or 10 minutes, and I said, do not make the decision now. Make the decision tomorrow morning. Just put your hand on your heart. Ask yourself, can I trust this person? If the answer comes yes, come to me. If you don't come to me, or come back to me another time. The second thing is, do they have a process? And is this process going to be 3 years and painful? Or is it going to be short with rapid results and little to no pain at all? The process that I've developed over 15 to 20 years, I call subconscious rapid transformation technique. It's a process that is so effective for trauma. You don't relive the trauma. You don't relive the pain. I guide you through it. And I'll use the example of a 19-year-old client who just texted me today. In fact, I texted him to say, hey, how are you doing? And he said to me, I've just started yoga and almost all of my anxiety has disappeared. We've done 3 sessions. When he first came to me, he was having panic attacks every day, serious panic attacks, anxiety and panic attacks every day. 2 weeks after the first session, I said to him, how are you doing? And he said, I've only had 2 panic attacks. And then we did another session the week after that. I said, how are you doing? He said, I only had 1 panic attack, and I was able to diminish it. I was able to control it and let it go. So the help is out there. I don't know if my phone is telling me that my battery's low, but there's some important message coming up. I guess that's what it might be.
For me, saying that
we're running out of time.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's wrap up. Healing is about feeling safe and secure. It's about releasing all of the painful emotions. It's about changing the beliefs. It's about being able to come back to your core self so you feel safe to fully and freely express yourself, to be free of the pain, and to heal even your brain, to create new pathways in your brain so you have new behaviors and new outcomes. And I promise you, it's all possible. It's all doable. It can be done easily, gently, safely, and quite rapidly. And ask Clifton, he's experienced it and he's referred many clients to me, and I have about 4 therapists who refer trauma clients to me, and I have about 5 or 6 therapists who've come to me so that I could help them.
Yes. All right. So everyone, I hope you enjoyed that. I did have a slide that I added at the last minute with both of our contact information on, but the way this
you can pop it up and say goodbye
beforehand, it takes a long time to load, so it didn't load. So
Oh,
I'll send that out to you guys in the follow-up email. I'll send Dr. Wanis' website, which is just patrickwanis.com, and my website, cliftonbrantley.com, or my therapy website is abetterfamilynow.com. So if you want to get in touch with either one of us, but if you want to do trauma work, I strongly suggest that you get in touch with Dr. Wanis. Even if you're my client, do work with him so that the work we do will be a lot smoother. We can just focus on your relationship. That's my professional and personal advice to you.
Clifton, thank you very, very much. I know my battery's running out. We've got to go. Thank you very much. You are always such a role model. You're so exemplary that you live from your heart, you express from the heart, you show such genuine care and concern. The only reason you did this webinar is because you truly care about people and you want to help people. And anytime you send me clients, I'm always reminding them to come back and thank you for the genuine care and concern, because you have so much love and you express it from your heart. And that makes you a great person whom I sincerely honor, admire, and acknowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I truly appreciate it. I truly appreciate it.